Whether the world was technically at peace or a limited war was being fought on some far-flung battlefield, the people of the United States realized that their country must be stronger than ever before if the ultimate war of world destruction was to be avoided. In the Pacific, on Eniwetok Atoll, the strength to resist any aggressor was being developed to the utmost. On the efforts of the men occupied there depended the life or death of the free world. Japan wore the face of a conquered nation. The country's traditional way of life, which had prevailed for centuries, was altered overnight. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur became the new ruler of a people who were accustomed to swearing allegiance to one person, whom they considered supreme. The general was well suited to his role. Supreme commander of an occupation charged with exacting complete obedience from 80 million subjects of a nation which had until recently been a fanatical enemy. Technically, the Supreme Commander was to be advised by a council of representatives of the four allied powers which had waged war against Japan. But actually, this body was impotent from the start. The delegates were constantly at odds, and any recommendations they made were given scant attention. The deposed ruler of the Japanese people, Emperor Hirohito and the Empress Nagako, were stripped of their divinity by the occupation, but it was decided not to try the emperor as a war criminal. With the royal authority curtailed, the emperor had more time for his study of marine biology. The sparing of the emperor, still revered by his people, proved a good political move by the occupation. But Japan's top war leaders received far different treatment. The men charged with the responsibility for guiding Japan onto the road of aggression were taken in hand promptly by the occupation. The number one war criminal was General Hideki Tojo, wartime premier. On November 12, 1948, after hearings which lasted 2.5 years, the International Military Tribunal convened to pass sentence on some of the top Japanese war leaders. Premier Tojo was charged with the planning, preparation, initiation, and waging of aggressive war, and with violations of the laws and customs of war, and crimes against humanity. But by assuming full responsibility for the war as charged, Tojo reestablished his reputation for loyalty and courage. Finally, after the great mass of evidence had been sifted, the court pronounced sentence on the accused.
Accused Tojo Hideki, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East sentences you to death by hanging.
The occupation's job of controlling 80 million people who had until recently hated America and Americans went smoothly. The once despised GIs were assisted by Japanese police who had been judged trustworthy. The Japanese people seemed to reconcile themselves quickly to the fact that the war was over and they had lost. The course of Japan's political progress was not entirely smooth. A small but active communist group operated openly. The Japanese communists were more interested in their own objectives in Japan than in relations with Moscow. Some party leaders, like Sanzo Nosaka, were denounced by Russia. The Japanese communist paper, Akahata, was eventually suspended by occupation authorities. But the party itself was never formally outlawed. It was felt that it was far wiser to permit its members to demonstrate openly than to give their movement impetus by driving it underground. But in time, the activities of the party were rigidly checked. None of the party leaders was permitted to hold political office. The communist movement in Japan never became a matter of grave concern. Beginning in 1946, with the return from the USSR of Japanese prisoners of war, the ranks of Japan's communists swelled temporarily. These men had been forcibly indoctrinated during their stay in Russian territory. But any enthusiasm for communism the soldiers may have had usually evaporated quickly in the stimulating climate of the new Japan. In the new Japan, there was a decidedly conservative cast to the leadership of Japanese industry, matching the situation in Japanese political life. Considering the circumstances which existed at the end of the war, the accomplishments of the occupation in helping effect Japan's recovery have been notable. Most Americans in Japan find it hard to be sure what the Japanese people really think about democracy and the democratic institutions and habits they have acquired. It is still too early to determine whether democracy will really take root in Japan. Whatever the occupation's achievements prove ultimately to be, the U.S. has successfully transformed an enemy nation into an ally and gained the most important bastion against communism in the Far East. The urgent need for a military foothold in the Orient grows more apparent with each passing month. All over Eastern and Southern Asia, the end of World War II was followed by eruptions of nationalism. Eruptions which the Soviet Union in some areas turned to its own purposes. In the spring of 1945, American and Australian bombers opened up on Borneo, the largest island in the invaluable Dutch East Indies. Borneo, strategically located between Malaya and Australia, was an important invasion target, formed their familiar prelude to invasion. Australian soldiers went ashore at several points on the large island and drove inland against spirited resistance. Tank infantry teams made rapid progress. On June 10th, General MacArthur landed on Labuan Island off British North Borneo and congratulated the Australians on a job well done. Japanese domination over the peoples of Asia was nearing an end. With the end of World War II, the islands of the East Indies, which had been ruled by the Dutch before the war, became the new independent nation of Indonesia in the eyes of the people of those islands. In Yogyakarta, Java, Ahmed Sukarno, the native leader during the Japanese occupation, and a group of associates, proclaimed the independence of the Isles of the Indies. The nationalists consolidated their position quickly. Everyone available was enlisted to work in the common cause, the setting up of a functioning government strong enough to withstand any attacks upon it by the Allied forces scheduled soon to arrive. The nationalists were determined to stand their ground. In December 1945, the first Dutch troops arrived in the Indies, 4 months after Japan's surrender. The Dutch Marines were assigned to take over the job of keeping order and restoring the islands to Dutch rule, a job which had been performed by British troops until the arrival of the Dutch Queen's forces. The men went right to work in an attempt to quell the insurgents' rebellion. At Cirebon, on the island of Java, Dutch and Indonesian leaders effected a partial compromise of differences and a ceasefire in the Linggadjati Agreement. But that condition did not last long. Dutch troops moved into territory acknowledged to be Republican by the terms of the agreement. The Dutch police action resulted in a renewal of violence. A settlement of differences between the Dutch and Indonesians seemed more remote than ever. Bridges were destroyed by the retreating natives. The Indonesians ravaged their own land rather than have it prove useful to the Dutch. In mid-1947, the United Nations attempted mediation. Australia's delegate, William Hodgson, called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and peaceful arbitration. But the issue was far from being settled. The communists in Indonesia, who had been supporting the nationalists in their fight for independence, rebelled. The Republican troops went to work quickly, rounding up every communist they could locate. The uprising was ineptly staged, and within a month it was decisively crushed by the Indonesian Republican forces. With its leaders either captured or killed, the communist force collapsed, and the threat to the success of the nationalist cause ended. In December 1949, the islands of the Indies officially became the Republic of the United States of Indonesia. Elected president by the 16 Nagaras of the Federation of Indonesian States, Sukarno was sworn in a ceremony at Yogyakarta. The new ruler, who had collaborated with the Japanese, had been striving toward this day for some 30 years. Finally, after 4 years of fighting and negotiating, he and his people were officially recognized as an independent nation. In Indonesia, as elsewhere in Asia, colonialism was dying. India had been working toward an independent status for several decades. With World War II, the stirrings of nationalism throughout southern Asia accelerated the tempo of that movement. The people of the subcontinent of India had been promised a certain degree of self-rule by the British. Finally, on August 15, 1947, Jawaharlal Nehru represented India's millions at the ceremony in which Britain's Lord Mountbatten presented India her sovereignty. The new India became an important member of the British Commonwealth of Nations, but Britain no longer ruled the vast territory which held a dominant position in southern Asia. In Karachi, Lord Mountbatten attended another ceremony to celebrate the creation of a new independent nation. Mohammed Ali Jinnah and some 75 million supporters, mostly Muslim, were at last the masters of their own destiny as the sovereign nation of Pakistan. The new Muslim nation of Pakistan was carved out of parts of what had been the India of the British Empire. The balance of the Indian colonial territory became the new Hindu nation of India. But freedom for the peoples of the Indian subcontinent was accompanied by rioting and bloodshed. Hundreds of thousands died in these fierce clashes between the Muslims and Hindus over the division of the land between Pakistan and India. Some of the territory at issue became a no-man's land. Millions of natives left their homes to move to an area where their religion was honored. Muslims poured into Pakistan, and Hindus caught within the borders of the new Muslim nation migrated to the new India. For many, the move meant uprooting their lives, but no sacrifice was too great to make for their religious freedom. India's independence was a high point in the life of Mohandas Gandhi, the spiritual leader of the nation's millions and its most powerful nationalist leader. Passive resistance was Gandhi's approach, a doctrine he practiced with great effect in furthering the cause of nationalism. But in January 48, Gandhi was assassinated by a member of an extremist faction. India had lost her steadiest guiding hand. Thousands upon thousands paid homage to India's great leader. The mourners included not only Hindus, but Muslims, Sikhs, and Britons, who sincerely believed that the world had lost a great man. In Pakistan, as in India, strong efforts were made to effect conciliation of differences between the two nations. But in Kashmir, a disputed province, the strained situation flared into open warfare. To the Western world, Kashmir had long been a fabled, remote land. In 1947, Kashmir's Maharaja refused to accede to either India or Pakistan, and the fight was on. Indian armed forces arrived to combat the Muslim troops from Pakistan. In the closing months of 1947, the disturbance turned into a real war. On January 1st, 1949, through the efforts of the United Nations, a ceasefire was effected. Pakistan refused to withdraw its troops from the disputed province when India declared its intentions of keeping its soldiers in the area. Pakistan held some economic advantages over India, for in East Pakistan, the bulk of the world's jute is grown. Pakistan's supply of this precious fiber, no longer sent to India, was now shipped directly overseas. Both nations underwent rigid economic readjustment. Even India's fabulously wealthy Maharajas felt the pinch. They were stripped of much of their political power and some of their wealth. But India's former ruling classes still managed to lead a luxurious existence, far removed from the lot of the untouchables at the lowest level of Hindu life. For millions of India's people lived on only a few grains of rice. On January 26, 1950, the Republic of India was established. India had been a free nation for almost 2.5 years, but this ceremony heralded the severing of the bond with the British Crown.
That on and from this, the 26th day of January 1950, India, that is Bharat, shall be a sovereign, democratic republic.
The raising of the flag of the Republic's first president symbolized complete freedom to the Indian people. In Burma, which was granted its independence by Britain in 1948, a struggle for control was waged by about a dozen political factions of varying shades, including 2 communist groups. In nearby Malaya, Britain continued to rule. But its colonial administration was constantly challenged by communist guerrillas operating from the hills. British and colonial troops were pressed into service to protect Malaya's rubber plantations and tin mines from the raids of the guerrillas. But the soldiers had difficulty in coming to grips with an enemy which disappeared into thin air, or so it seemed to the colonial troops. In the years following the defeat of Japan, Britain's control of the Malay Peninsula was far from strong. The Philippine Islands had been promised their independence by 1946. But with the Japanese invasion and conquest of the islands, the people's hopes dimmed. But in spite of that strong setback, the Philippines celebrated their independence just as planned on July 4th, 1946.
With this ceremony, a new nation is born. A nation conceived in the centuries-old struggle of a people to attain the political liberty to embark upon its own national destiny. A nation upon whom the eyes of all oppressed peoples are today cast with the burning light of a new faith.
The formal declaration of Philippine independence was made by U.S. Commissioner Paul McNutt.
I am authorized and directed by the President of the United States to proclaim the independence of the Philippines as a separate and self-governing nation.
The infant republic experienced the customary growing pains during those first heady months of freedom. Philippine political life still reflected the upheaval caused by the war and the Japanese occupation. In fact, one of the election issues, in addition to government corruption and the control of communism, was the degree of collaboration with the Japanese indulged in by one or another of the candidates. The Philippine political picture remained muddled for many months. The first president of the republic was Manuel Rojas, who had worked with the Japanese, but was cleared by General MacArthur. The Huck Falahaps constituted the government's biggest headache. Once strongly anti-Japanese, the Hucks now trained their sights on the new government and its policies. With the end of World War II, French Indochina seemed destined for a revival of French colonial administration. In the French Empire, no colony was more desirable than Indochina. General Jacques Leclerc, the liberator of Paris, arrived in Indochina in late 1945 to conduct mopping-up operations against the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese were ardent nationalists who lived in an area comprising almost half of French Indochina. The bitter clashes with the French troops marked the start of a full-scale war which continued for some 17 months. The French proclaimed their control and backed up their statements by force of arms. French soldiers were fighting in dead earnest. For Frenchmen, no part of the war-ravaged colony was entirely safe. The military operations the French were conducting against the Vietnamese were in no way dissipating the natives' desperate urge for freedom from French colonial rule as they had known it before the Japanese occupation. Most of the fighting was in Vietnam, which includes 3 of the 5 countries comprising pre-war French Indochina. Finally, on June 14, 1949, the independent state of Vietnam, under Bao Dai, former Emperor of Annam, was recognized by the French as independent, but existing within the French Union. But to the natives of Vietnam, even this limited form of independence under a leader who did as directed by the French was some improvement over pre-war French colonial rule. The age-old countries of Cochin China, Annam, and Tonkin, united as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, embarked on a new era in the history of Southeast Asia, a period which bore only surface resemblances to the era which ended in Asia with World War II. This new day was inaugurated in Vietnam as elsewhere throughout Asia with warfare. The most urgent task facing the French and Vietnamese was the job of containing the advances of communist Viet Minh forces, which were operating in strong guerrilla groups throughout Vietnam. To the north, Asia's most troubled country, China, moved right from one war, that with Japan, to another, the war with the communist forces, without a pause. Chiang Kai-shek had led China through a series of great crises, but with the end of war with Japan, Chiang and China embarked on an even more critical period. The new antagonist, Chinese Communist Mao Zedong, gained adherents quickly. Chiang's forces fought a long, exhausting series of campaigns in a vain attempt to stop the communist advance from spreading across China. Over a period of 2 years after the end of World War II, China received hundreds of millions of dollars worth of material aid from UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. The major part of that assistance, about 2/3 of the total amount, was furnished by the U.S. In late 1945, General George Marshall arrived in China to try to effect a ceasefire between the two Chinese forces. At first, his mission seemed headed for success. During January 1946, a series of conferences involving both nationalists and communists achieved some positive results. On January 10th, a ceasefire agreement was reached, endorsed by the nationalists and communists in the mediator's presence. But the Marshall Mission and a subsequent survey of the problem conducted by General Albert Wedemeyer both proved inconclusive. Meanwhile, Mao's forces grew stronger while the debate raged on what U.S.-China policy should be. By early 1949, Mao commanded a formidable fighting force. In late May of that year, Shanghai fell to the advancing Chinese Communist armies. The Communist soldiers moved quickly into the heart of the city, which had been evacuated by the Nationalists after they had boasted that they would defend it with the last drop of their blood. The Chinese civilians in Shanghai were quick to applaud their new masters. Overnight, Shanghai's population became ardently communistic. In Beiping, in October 1949, Russia's ambassador, Chosin, presented his credentials to Mao Zedong, and the bond between the Chinese Communists and the Soviet Union was cemented. Mao Zedong, once a lowly party worker, now assumed the stature of the dominant figure in all of Eastern Asia. The nationalist troops, those that hadn't joined forces with the Communists, fled southward with their families. Many surrendered their weapons to the French in Indochina. The nationalist defense of China had turned into a rout. From a small area in North China, Mao's forces swept over all of mainland China. Formosa provided a haven for Chiang and the remnants of his army. Beginning in December 1949, on his island sanctuary, Chiang worked toward the day when China could be freed from the communist yoke. He had the support of the United States, but Britain, by recognizing Red China, weakened the cause of Generalissimo and Madame Chiang.
Britain has bartered the soul of a nation for a few pieces of silver. I say, for shame to Britain. One day, these pieces of silver will bear interest in British blood, sweat, and tears on the battleground of freedom. For that which is morally wrong can never be politically right.
In addition to U.S. military aid for his troops, Chiang was further aided by the presence in waters off Formosa of the U.S. 7th Fleet, which was assigned by the U.S. to save the island from the Communists. In Korea, which had been ruled by the Chinese and the Japanese during the past century, the end of World War II introduced two allied powers, Russia and the United States, which occupied the northern and southern sections of the country.
It is my sincere belief that our great victories on the battlefields of the world will be followed by complete cooperation and collaboration around the council tables of the great nations, resulting in continuance of world peace, and at our conferences here will solve the pressing problems of the Korean people.
I greet the Korean people who are liberated from the long oppression of the Japanese imperialists by the glorious troops of the Red Army and the army of our allies, the United States of America. General Hertz, I would like to express assurance that our negotiations with your representative will bring the solution of urgent problems having vital importance for the whole of Korea.
In North Korea, the Soviet interpretation of administration and occupation consisted of impressing communism on the country. Soon after the Russians arrived, a communist government was functioning in North Korea under such native leaders as Communist Kim Il-sung, a Russian puppet. At the end of World War II, Korea had been divided arbitrarily at the 38th parallel. South of that degree of latitude, the U.S. was the occupying power. On August 15, 1948, the U.S. made South Korea an independent republic. Most South Koreans were determined to protect that newly won freedom. In August 1948, that job did not seem too difficult. But during the first years of the infant republic's existence, the job of protecting that independence assumed larger proportions. Communist demonstrations inspired by natives in the northern half of Korea gave the first inkling of further trouble ahead. The 38th parallel of latitude was to prove a most ineffectual barrier against the sweep of communist aggression from the north. The Koreans made an earnest attempt to arrive at a basis for closer understanding with the occupying U.S. force. But to the South Koreans, young and old, it was difficult to comprehend the mysterious foreigners from another hemisphere, putting American methods into the life of South Korea. American occupation forces checked the spread of disease and helped the South Koreans themselves to work more effectively toward improving the national health. In South Korea, at least, the people seemed destined for a somewhat better life than they had known for centuries. By mid-1950, almost 5 years after the end of World War II, South Korea had built up an army of some 100,000 men, trained by American Army officers and non-coms. The South Koreans felt in the spring of 1950 that they could handle any attack from across the 38th parallel. But in late June, that boundary was crossed in force by the North Koreans. The communist thrust across the 38th parallel heralded the beginning of one of the most tragic periods in the history of the Korean people. The South Korean forces had proved pitifully inadequate for the job of withstanding the invaders. For the citizens of the infant Republic of Korea, whose independence had been proudly proclaimed less than 2 years before, the immediate future looked all but hopeless. The unquiet peace which had existed among the great powers of the world since World War II was at an end. In the U.S., at Lake Success, the United Nations, with the Soviet member conspicuously absent, took enforcement action against the aggressor.
48 hours ago, the Security Council, in an emergency session, determined that the armed invasion of the Republic of Korea by armed forces from Northern Korea constituted a breach of the peace. Accordingly, the Security Council called for a cessation of hostilities forthwith and the withdrawal of the Northern Korean authorities of their armed forces to the 38th parallel. It is clear that the authorities in North Korea have completely disregarded and flouted the decision of the Security Council. The armed invasion of the Republic of Korea continues. This is, in fact, an attack on the United Nations itself.
Agreed that the armed attack upon the Republic of Korea constituted a breach of the peace, the United Nations of the world took decisive action.
To secure peace and security recommends that the members of the United Nations furnish such assistance to the Republic of Korea as may be necessary to repel the armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area.
In Korea, for the first time, enforcement action was taken against an aggressor by direction of the United Nations.
On 28 June, aircraft of the United States Air Force, operating pursuant to the resolution of the Security Council of the United Nations, began air operations against the North Korean invaders in support of Republic of Korea forces, and later struck at military targets north of the 38th parallel with a view to disrupting the lines of communication and supply of the invading forces. badly decimated Republic of Korea forces reformed south of the Han River, sought to delay the North Korean advance. By sheer weight of numbers and materiel, they were forced back step by step until on 2 July, the town of Suwon, 20 miles south of Seoul, was reported in North Korean hands. Meanwhile, in pursuance of United Nations recommendations, United States ground forces were committed to the area for stabilization of the front. On 5 July, a very small United States force made contact with the invaders south of Suwon. The first United States troops were small in number and were committed as a holding force only. They were followed by additional supporting forces as rapidly as these could be transported to the battle line, facing odds at times as high as 20 to 1. Our Army troops distinguished themselves in the most difficult of military operations, a delaying action.
The first UN heroes were American GIs of the 24th Division. In the deserted villages of South Korea, the nations of the free world would shortly make their stand against the forces of aggression. In Tokyo, the appointment of General Douglas MacArthur as commander of United Nations forces was celebrated in a ceremony conducted by U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General Lawton Collins. During the first weeks of fighting, South Korean and American forces were pushed back toward the tip of the Korean peninsula and the prospect of another Dunkirk. The outnumbered UN forces took heavy losses during that first month in the desperate fight for time. On July 31st, elements of the 1st Marine Division arrived at Busan, swelling the force of American fighting men in Korea to some 100,000. To keep the enemy from overrunning all of Korea approached its most critical stage. In Korea, the identity of the aggressor was no mystery. By late August, the North Korean forces had seized most of South Korea, except for an area surrounding the port of Busan. With their backs to the sea, American forces fought desperately to hold their ground against the powerful enemy drive. The crucial battle was fought in the hills flanking Taegu. It was a bruising fight for the bone-weary American GIs. But they never gave up the battle. In holding the Busan perimeter, the American forces suffered heavily. But the enemy offensive was beaten back. Thanks to the sacrifices of American fighting men, Korea did not become a communist peninsula. By early September, the Busan perimeter was no longer in immediate danger of being overrun. On September 15th, the tide of battle turned by virtue of a daring amphibious attack at Incheon. The attack force which made the assault on Korea's west coast was engaged in an extremely difficult operation. An operation undertaken at the insistence of General MacArthur. The problems of fluctuating tides, unpredictable currents, and narrow channels made the success of the Incheon landing a doubtful quantity. The burden of responsibility for risking the forces committed in an operation which might well prove a failure rested with General MacArthur. 12,000 Marines, many veterans of World War II, headed for shore in the first amphibious assault of the Korean War. With the Marines who stormed the beaches at Walmy and Incheon was Time Life correspondent Frank Gibney, also a veteran of the war with Japan.
Some of the Marines in the assault had been brought from duty in the Mediterranean. Others had been pulled out of the line in southern Korea. Incheon had to be taken to cut the enemy's communications with the southern front and to trap thousands of his troops in between. The Marines didn't give the enemy time to recover from the surprise attack on his flank. Progress was swift. Many of the Marines I was with were past masters at flushing enemy troops out of holes, an acquired talent they never lost. Hundreds of North Koreans were killed on that overcast September morning, D-Day at Incheon. The surprised North Korean troops had failed completely in their hurried attempt to beat off the amphibious attack. The operation was a spectacular success, a proud day for General MacArthur, whose judgment was vindicated, and for Marine General O.P. Smith.
On the southern front, the situation had changed considerably by virtue of the Incheon operation. For the enemy, the battle had taken a turn for the worse. U.S. 8th Army GIs smashed into enemy positions with renewed spirit and moved slowly but steadily forward. In the Incheon area, the Marines stepped up the attack in a drive to take Seoul as quickly as possible. On September 24th, only 10 days after D-Day at Incheon, U.S. Marines and soldiers were fighting in Seoul. The fight for the South Korean capital was bloody, but relatively brief. For 5 days, the battle for Seoul raged on. The U.S. troops took their losses, but efficiently stamped out enemy resistance. 3 months after the communist invasion, Seoul was once again free. Thousands returned to the homes they had abandoned before the communist thrust overwhelmed the Korean Republic's capital. Other thousands upon thousands had stayed on during the communist occupation. As soon as the fight for Seoul was ended, they fell to work, rebuilding their badly battered city. For the inhabitants of Seoul, life was a good deal more makeshift than it had been before the communist invasion. Government officials of the Republic of Korea who returned to Seoul after its recapture addressed the inhabitants, who had been subjected to daily doses of communist propaganda, on South Korea's immediate problems. During the summer of 1950, many thousands of South Koreans were killed by their countrymen from the north. Whatever the future held for Korea, it could hardly prove more tragic than the early years of the infant republic's existence. In many lands, freedom had been achieved by bloodshed, but nowhere was newly won freedom put to a stronger test than in the Republic of Korea. By early autumn, fighting forces from other member countries of the United Nations arrived in South Korea to join the struggle in defense of South Korean independence. To that crusade, Britain committed some 5,000 soldiers. Several of the nations which had fought in the Pacific during World War II sent troops to South Korea. 1,000 Filipino soldiers and 1,000 Australians swelled the ranks of the United Nations forces. The diggers from down under, who had fought so well in the steaming jungles of New Guinea 8 years before, were determined to add further laurels to their battlefield record in Korea. On October 1st, South Korean troops pushed northward across the 38th parallel, 3 months and 1 week after the communist attack. As the ROKs, Republic of Korea soldiers, seized more and more territory in their northward drive, there were impromptu celebrations commemorating the liberation of the area. The Koreans along the route seemed genuinely happy to greet the advancing ROK forces. The city of Kaesong, just south of the 38th parallel, was seized by Americans of the 1st Cavalry Division on October 8th. The GIs then drove quickly north to the well-publicized boundary, which the UN had authorized its forces to cross. By October 15th, United Nations troops had swept across the 38th parallel and seized a considerable area in North Korea. 2,500 miles east, Wake Island was the scene of a most important engagement that mid-October morning. President Harry Truman had flown 7,000 miles to talk with his top general in the Far East, a man he had never before met. They conferred for 1 hour in complete privacy, and then held a more general discussion in one of Wake Island's few buildings. This conference included the President's top military advisors, Joint Chiefs Chairman Bradley and Army Secretary Pace. Before the meeting broke up, a decoration ceremony was held, to the delight of the photographers. Though only the two men knew what had been said at the secret meeting, they claimed to be in complete agreement. On October 20th, ROC soldiers and American GIs seized the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. After 5 years, the communist hold on that city had been broken by the UN forces. 2 days later, 120 troop carrier planes transported paratroopers of the 187th Airborne Regiment to an area some 25 miles north of Pyongyang. Over the target area, near Sukchan and Suncheon, the paratroopers hit the silk. General MacArthur cruised above the area, watching the initial stage of the operation. The 800-foot drop took each man only about a minute. The operation went off smoothly. The drop was made at precisely the points indicated in the original planning. The trap on the enemy was sprung. Some 30,000 North Koreans were bottled up between the UN forces in Pyongyang to the south and the men of the 187th Airborne Regiment. Completely taken by surprise by this unfamiliar maneuver. On North Korea's east coast, off Wonsan, U.S. minesweepers went to work on clearing out one of the most intensive sea minefields in military history. The job was done by laying magnetic line. Finally, after a 6-day delay, the landing at Wonsan was made by advance elements of the 1st Marine Division. But this landing was not in the tradition of marine amphibious invasions, for the area had already been taken 2 weeks earlier by other UN troops. Though the landing was no problem, the Marines had been alerted to expect plenty of action when they reached shore and began the push along the east coast of the peninsula. The Marines' first assignment was to mop up a large group of organized North Korean guerrillas. The job was done efficiently by men who were experienced in that line of work. The Marines fighting along the east coast were part of the U.S. 10th Corps, a combined Marine Army force commanded by U.S. Army Major General Edward Alman, who reported directly to General MacArthur in Tokyo. On Korea's west coast, Lieutenant General Walton Walker commanded the U.S. 8th Army. Both U.S. forces were driving pell-mell toward the northern boundary of Korea. That objective received the full attention of both 8th Army and 10th Corps commanders, who did not coordinate their movements but reported independently to Tokyo. The frozen Yalu, which separates Korea from Manchuria, was reached at the North Korean town of Haesanjin by GIs of the 7th Division. Most of the men felt that this achievement signaled the answer to their prayers, the end of the war, and a chance to get home for Christmas. But the GIs did not realize on that cold November afternoon that an even greater enemy across the Yalu was about to attack. On November 26th, in a move which stunned the UN forces, the Chinese Reds hurled their armies into North Korea and drove deep into the soft center of the UN line.